Michael Carter's polished leather shoes echoed through the underground subway station as he hurried to catch the last train of the night. It was late, and the fatigue from his long day on set weighed on his shoulders. His mind raced with the usual frenzy of production schedules, budget issues, and demanding actors, but all of that screeched to a halt when he noticed a small figure curled up on a bench, trembling. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, sat huddled in the corner of the platform, clutching a torn, oversized jacket around her fragile body. Her face was streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with fear, darting toward every passing figure as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. Michael's instincts kicked in before his thoughts could catch up. He walked toward her, hesitant but determined. She flinched at first, shrinking into herself as if trying to disappear into the bench. His heart clenched at the sight. "Hey there, are you lost?" His voice was soft, trying not to scare her any more than she already seemed to be. The girl didn't respond. She only stared at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of distrust and sheer exhaustion. Michael crouched down to her level, careful to maintain some distance. "My name's Michael. You look like you could use some help," he tried again, his tone gentle but firm. "It's late, and you shouldn't be here alone." The girl's lips parted, but no words came out. Her fingers clutched the jacket tighter. Michael looked around, scanning the area for any sign of an adult, a parent, a guardian, someone responsible for her. But the station was eerily empty, save for the occasional passerby rushing for the next train. Michael felt a surge of protectiveness. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a lost child waiting for a parent to return. There was an air of desperation clinging to her, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that if he walked away now, something terrible would happen. He took a deep breath, deciding to take a risk. "I can take you somewhere safe, all right? It's not far, and you can rest there. We'll figure out what's going on." Still no answer. But as he stood up and extended his hand, the girl hesitated only for a moment before slowly reaching out and placing her small hand in his. Her touch was cold, almost icy. As they walked toward the exit, Michael glanced down at her, trying to piece together what had led her to this point. She couldn't have been out here for long. No child could survive the city streets alone for more than a night without attracting attention. Yet, something about her presence seemed unsettling. Her silence, her wide eyes, they told a story that words couldn't. The drive back to his mansion was tense. The girl sat in the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the road ahead, but her mind seemed miles away. Michael kept glancing at her, unsure if he should break the silence or wait for her to speak. What if she never did? What if no one was looking for her? What if something much darker lay behind her fear? By the time they reached his home, the girl had fallen into a light, restless sleep. Michael scooped her up gently, carrying her inside as he tried to calm the growing unease gnawing at him. His luxurious mansion, usually a fortress of comfort and peace, felt cold and empty in the face of this unexpected guest. Laying her down on the couch in his living room, he covered her with a warm blanket. The flickering light from the fireplace cast shadows across her fragile form. She looked so small, so vulnerable, in the vastness of his home. Michael stood over her for a moment, his mind racing. Who was she? Why was she alone in the subway? He had no answers, just an overwhelming sense that whatever her story was, it was far from simple. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him out of his thoughts. Work. His assistant reminding him of tomorrow's meetings and tasks, the never-ending grind of his high-profile life. But now, that life felt insignificant. This girl, this silent, frightened child, had just changed everything. Michael sighed, glancing back at her one more time before stepping away to make a few calls. The police? Maybe? No, she hadn't said anything. And what if whoever she was running from was still out there? He couldn't risk it, not until he knew more. As he walked down the hallway toward his office, his thoughts spiraled. He had no idea that this one moment, this one choice to take in a lost child, would set off a chain of events that would turn his life upside down. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. And somewhere, deep in the darkness of the night, someone was watching. The morning sun crept through the curtains as Michael paced the living room, his phone in hand, scrolling through unanswered texts and emails. He had barely slept, his thoughts consumed by the little girl resting on his couch. The questions, the uncertainty, it all weighed heavily on him. He wasn't even sure what to do next. Every scenario seemed too risky. A soft knock on the door broke his train of thought. Michael glanced at the clock. It was too early for anyone to be stopping by. He opened the door cautiously, only to feel his heart drop into his stomach. Standing in front of him, looking just as shocked as he felt, was Sarah Collins. Sarah? His voice came out as a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Sarah, his ex-girlfriend, the woman he hadn't seen in nearly 8 years, stood before him, her eyes searching his face for answers. Michael. She looked down briefly, collecting herself before continuing. We need to talk. Before he could respond, her eyes shifted past him to the couch, where the little girl lay, still asleep. Sarah's face softened immediately, and something in her expression changed. Recognition. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped into the house, her eyes fixed on the child. Is that her? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Michael was still reeling from seeing her after so long. Her? What do you mean? Do you know her? Sarah turned to him, her expression somber. Michael, that girl. Her name is Emma. She paused, her next words hanging in the air like a bomb ready to detonate. She's your daughter. For a moment, Michael didn't breathe. The weight of her words knocked the wind out of him, leaving him standing there, frozen. His daughter? He had a daughter? He felt the world tilt beneath him as if everything he thought he knew had just shattered. What are you talking about? His voice was barely above a whisper, disbelief lacing every word. I don't. How is that even possible? You never said anything, Sarah. Her eyes filled with regret, but there was a fierce determination behind them as well. I know, Michael. I know I should have told you, but you have to understand. Back then, we were in completely different places. You were consumed by your career, and I didn't want to burden you with a child? With my child? Michael's voice rose, the shock giving way to anger. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. You made that decision for both of us? How could you keep this from me? Sarah took a deep breath, clearly struggling with the emotions bubbling to the surface. It wasn't an easy decision. I thought I was doing what was best for her, and for you. I wasn't in a place to raise a child on my own, and I didn't think you were either. So, I put her up for adoption, hoping she'd have a better life than what I could give her. Michael ran a hand through his hair, pacing again as his mind tried to process this revelation. His heart raced as flashes of their past relationship flickered in his memory. How they drifted apart, him focused on making it big in the film industry, her pulling away, but he never imagined, never knew. Why are you telling me this now? His voice softened, though the hurt still simmered beneath the surface. Why show up after all these years? Sarah looked toward Emma, her expression shifting from regret to concern. Because she's in danger, Michael. She's been through a lot, and things have gone wrong. I found out recently that her adoptive parents, they couldn't keep her. She's been back in the system, bounced from one home to another. Michael's stomach twisted as he glanced at the sleeping girl, her small form curled under the blanket. Back in the system? You mean? Yes. Sarah interrupted, her voice barely steady. She ran away, and now someone is after her. Someone dangerous. Michael felt the tension rise in his chest, every nerve on edge. Who's after her? It's complicated, Sarah said, her hands clasping together, the anxiety evident. I've been working as a social worker, and in one of my cases, I stumbled onto something dangerous. There are people who wouldn't think twice about hurting Emma to get to me. I've been trying to keep her safe, but I didn't expect her to find you. I only found out she was missing last night. Michael's mind raced, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. His daughter, was not only a child he never knew existed, but now she was in danger. And Sarah, the woman he once loved, had dragged them both into something far darker than he had ever imagined. Why didn't you come to me sooner, Sarah? His voice cracked, a mix of desperation and betrayal. I could have helped. I would have been there. I didn't know how, she admitted quietly. I was scared. Scared of what you'd think of me, of what I'd done. But right now, none of that matters. We have to protect her. Michael, I need your help. There was a raw vulnerability in her eyes, a plea that cut through his anger. He wanted to be furious, wanted to lash out at her for keeping something so monumental from him. But as he looked at Emma, her small, fragile figure, none of that seemed important anymore. Michael nodded, his mind already shifting into action mode. Okay, we'll figure this out. But first, we need to keep her safe. He turned to Sarah, his expression hardening with resolve. I don't care what's happened between us. Right now, it's about her. Whatever it takes, we'll protect Emma. And as those words left his lips, Michael felt something shift inside him. The shock and anger slowly began to transform into something else. Responsibility, fatherhood, love. His life had changed in an instant, and there was no going back. Michael sat in silence, staring at the woman who had just flipped his world upside down. The quiet tension between him and Sarah filled the room, the air heavy with everything unsaid. Across the room, Emma remained asleep, unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. Her soft breaths were the only sound, a stark contrast to the whirlpool of emotions Michael felt. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and strained. Why didn't you tell me, Sarah? All those years. I could have been there for her. I had a right to know. Sarah's eyes welled with a mixture of guilt and frustration. She looked down, as if the floor might provide answers. You don't understand, she began, her voice tight. Back then, you weren't the Michael I see now. You were consumed by your career. You barely had time for us, let alone a child. Michael felt a pang in his chest. She wasn't wrong. Those days, he had been distant, laser-focused on his dream of making it big in Hollywood. But it still felt like a betrayal, like she had made the decision for both of them without giving him a say. I should have had the choice, Sarah, he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. You can't just decide that for me. Her face tightened, a flash of anger crossing her features. And what would you have done, Michael? Back then, you barely answered my calls. You were halfway around the world half the time. Do you think I could have raised her alone, with you dropping in and out of our lives whenever you felt like it? He flinched at the sting of her words, the truth hitting too close to home. She wasn't just accusing him of neglecting their relationship. She was accusing him of abandoning the life they could have had. And somewhere deep down, he knew she wasn't entirely wrong. Still, the betrayal burned. But you didn't even give me the chance. You didn't tell me you were pregnant, Sarah. You didn't even let me try. Her shoulders slumped, the fight seeming to drain out of her. I thought I was doing the right thing. You were on the verge of something huge. I didn't want to be the one to hold you back. She looked over at Emma, her expression softening. And when I held her for the first time, I knew I couldn't give her the life she deserved. So, I thought adoption was the best option. Michael ran a hand through his hair, pacing again. The anger, the hurt, it twisted in his chest, tangled with a sense of loss he hadn't even known was there. He had missed everything. Her birth, her first steps, her first words. He had missed being a father, all because Sarah had made a decision without him. She's my daughter, Sarah, he said, his voice breaking slightly, and I didn't even know she existed. Sarah's eyes filled with regret. I know, and I'm sorry, Michael. I should have told you, but it's too late to change that now. All we can do is figure out how to move forward. He stopped pacing, his back turned to her as he stared out the window. His mind was racing, trying to grasp everything at once. The woman he had once loved, the daughter he never knew he had, and the threat that now loomed over all of them. What do we do now? He finally asked, his voice quieter, resigned. Sarah stood up, walking over to him. She hesitated before speaking. I've been trying to keep her safe, but I can't do it alone. I need your help, Michael. Whoever's after her, they're dangerous. I don't even know how far they'll go. Michael turned to face her, their eyes locking for the first time since she had walked through the door. There was fear in her eyes, but there was also a determination that he hadn't seen in her before. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about survival. I'm not going anywhere, he said firmly. I'll protect her, whatever it takes. Sarah let out a breath, relief washing over her features. Thank you. I didn't know if you could handle all of this." Michael frowned, the hurt still lingering. "I can handle being a father, Sarah. I should have been handling it all along." The silence between them settled again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the silence of unresolved anger or hurt. It was the quiet realization that the stakes had changed. There was no room for old wounds, not now. As if on cue, Emma stirred on the couch, her small form shifting under the blanket. Her eyes fluttered open, disoriented but slowly waking to the unfamiliar surroundings. She looked around, her gaze falling on Michael and Sarah. For a brief moment, confusion clouded her face, but then recognition flickered in her eyes when she saw Sarah. "Mom," she whispered, her voice small, hesitant. Sarah immediately moved to her side, kneeling down next to her. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "How are you feeling?" Emma blinked, her eyes darting between Sarah and Michael. Where are we?" "You're safe," Michael answered, stepping closer but keeping his distance, unsure of how much to say. He didn't want to overwhelm her. "This is my house. You can stay here as long as you need." Emma's gaze lingered on him, a mix of curiosity and uncertainty flickering in her young eyes. She didn't know him. He was a stranger to her. Michael felt a pang in his chest, realizing that he had so much to make up for, so much lost time. Sarah spoke gently, trying to ease the tension. "Emma, this is Michael. He's someone very important." Michael's heart skipped a beat at the words. How did you tell a child you were her father after so many years of being absent? How did you start from here? But before he could think of what to say, Emma sat up slowly, looking at Sarah with wide, worried eyes. "Are they still looking for me?" Michael's stomach twisted. The fear in her voice was unmistakable, and it cut through him like a knife. Whoever was after her was real, and they were close enough to make a little girl terrified. Sarah squeezed her hand. "We won't let anything happen to you, I promise." She glanced at Michael, her eyes pleading. "We're going to keep you safe, okay? Michael's going to help us." Emma hesitated, her small fingers tightening around Sarah's hand, but she nodded, trusting her mother's words. As Michael stood there, watching the fragile scene between mother and daughter, he realized that this was no longer just about him or Sarah or the years they had lost. This was about Emma now, and there was no turning back. He had a daughter, and she was in danger, and Michael Carter wasn't about to let anyone harm her. The quiet of Michael's house was unsettling. Normally, the expansive rooms and modern decor provided a sense of peace after long days on set, but now, every shadow seemed to pulse with unseen threats. The tension hung heavy in the air, thickening with each passing minute. Michael's mind spun with thoughts of the danger Sarah had hinted at and the fear that clouded Emma's innocent eyes. Emma had fallen back asleep, her small body still curled up on the couch, her breath steady but shallow. Michael and Sarah stood by the kitchen island, speaking in hushed tones as the gravity of the situation sank in deeper. "You need to tell me everything," Michael whispered urgently, leaning towards Sarah. "If we're going to protect her, I need to know what we're up against." "Who's after her, Sarah?" Sarah exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples as if trying to ease the weight of everything she had to confess. She leaned against the counter, eyes clouded with a mix of guilt and anxiety. "It's complicated," she began, her voice low, careful not to wake Emma. "When I started working as a social worker, I got involved with some pretty rough cases. One, in particular, involved a group of people, dangerous people, Michael. They were involved in human trafficking." Michael's jaw clenched, the words hitting him hard. His pulse quickened as his mind pieced together the nightmare Sarah was describing. "I didn't realize how deep it went until it was too late," she continued, her voice trembling. "I uncovered some things, names, locations. It was enough to put several of them in prison, but not all of them were caught. Some got away, and they weren't happy about the ones I helped take down. I started receiving threats." Michael's hand tightened into a fist. He had known there was danger, but this was beyond what he had imagined. "And now they're after Emma? Because of you?" Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with regret. "They found out about her, Michael. I don't know how, But they did. They threatened to hurt her if I didn't stop digging into their operation. That's why I placed her with another family. I thought she'd be safer away from me, but it didn't work. They're still looking for her. I think they've been following her for weeks. Michael's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to act, to protect. He could feel the adrenaline building, the fierce need to shield Emma from whatever darkness was closing in on them. "How close are they?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. Sarah swallowed hard. "I don't know. They've been sending messages. I thought I could stay ahead of them, but then Emma ran away. I was so scared, Michael. I didn't know where she was, and if they found her before I did." She stopped, her breath catching as she fought back the panic threatening to spill over. Michael put a hand on her arm, steadying her. "They didn't find her. We did. And now, we're going to make sure they never get close to her." Sarah nodded, trying to pull herself together. But the fear in her eyes was undeniable. They both knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Just as Michael was about to ask more questions, his phone buzzed on the counter. The sound startled them both, their nerves stretched taut by the weight of the conversation. Michael quickly snatched it up, glancing at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. His stomach dropped as he read the text. "You can't hide her forever, Michael. We know where she is." Michael's heart slammed against his chest. His hands tightened around the phone, every muscle in his body tensing as the words sunk in. How had they found them so quickly? Sarah noticed the shift in his expression, her face pale with dread. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He showed her the screen, the text still glowing ominously. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. "No, no, no, no," she murmured, her voice cracking. "They've already found us." Michael forced himself to think, to focus. They needed a plan, and they needed one fast. He grabbed Sarah by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me. We're not going to panic. We'll call the police. We'll lock down this place. But we have to stay calm. Do you understand?" She nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the phone, as if waiting for it to deliver the next blow. The reality of their situation was suffocating. They were already being watched, their every move under surveillance by people who wouldn't hesitate to strike. Michael quickly moved through the house, checking the locks on every window and door, securing every possible entry point. His mansion, once a place of comfort, now felt like a trap. No matter how many locks he turned or alarms he set, there was no shaking the feeling that danger was already inside, lurking in the shadows. Back in the living room, Sarah stood by Emma, watching over her protectively. She looked up at Michael as he re-entered, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve. "We need help," she said quietly. "We can't do this alone." Michael nodded, his mind racing through their options. The police would help, sure, but how much protection could they really offer against people like this? People who operated in the shadows, who had connections that reached further than law enforcement could touch. "We'll call the police," he said, though doubt laced his words. "And we'll figure out the next steps. I have some contacts, people who can help with security. I'll make the calls." But even as he said it, Michael knew that they were on borrowed time. Whoever had sent that text wasn't bluffing. They were closing in, and fast. As Michael dialed his phone, his hands shook slightly. He forced himself to stay focused, to push down the fear gnawing at the edges of his resolve. The stakes had never been higher. But as the call went through, and the voice on the other end picked up, a single thought consumed him. Whatever it took, he wouldn't let them get to Emma. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the curtains, but Michael felt no relief. The night had been long, filled with restless sleep and the constant gnawing sense that danger was looming. He sat at the dining table, staring blankly at his phone. No new messages, no new threats. But that didn't mean they weren't out there, watching. Sarah moved quietly around the kitchen, trying to keep herself busy, though it was clear she was just as on edge as he was. Every creak in the house, every passing car outside, made them both flinch. They were prisoners in Michael's own home, locked in by fear. Emma sat at the table with a bowl of cereal in front of her, but she wasn't eating. Her eyes were distant, her small hands resting on her lap. It was heartbreaking for Michael to watch. He had only just discovered she was his daughter, and now, instead of bonding or getting to know her, they were living in a constant state of alert. "You okay, kiddo?" Michael asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Emma nodded, though she didn't look up. She had been quiet all morning, as if the fear that gripped the adults had seeped into her as well. Michael's heart clenched. He wanted to make things right, to give her a sense of normalcy, but the reality was their lives had been turned upside down. Sarah sat down across from Emma, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart," she said softly. "Michael and I are figuring it out. You're safe here." But Emma didn't respond. Her silence was heavy, filled with more than just fear. It was the silence of a child who had seen too much, who had learned too early that the world could be cruel. Michael's phone buzzed, shattering the uneasy quiet. He nearly jumped out of his seat, his pulse quickening, but when he looked at the screen, it wasn't another threat. It was a call from a contact, a private security firm he had reached out to late last night. He stepped away from the table, answering quickly. "Michael Carter speaking," he said, his voice tense. "Mr. Carter, we've received your request and can have a team at your residence by this afternoon." The man on the other end responded professionally. "We specialize in personal protection and home security. We'll ensure your family's safety." Michael nodded, feeling a small wave of relief. "Thank you. I'll send you the address. How soon can you be here?" "Give us a few hours. We'll be fully operational by tonight," the man assured him. After hanging up, Michael felt a faint sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. At least they wouldn't be completely defenseless. He returned to the kitchen, trying to project confidence, even though the knot of anxiety hadn't loosened in his chest. "Security team will be here this afternoon," he said, sitting down across from Sarah. "We'll be safe here. They'll monitor everything." Sarah nodded, but there was no joy in her expression. "We can't stay locked in here forever, Michael. At some point, we'll need a real plan. We need to figure out who's behind this and stop them." Michael glanced at Emma, his protective instinct screaming at him to do whatever it took to keep her safe. But Sarah was right. They couldn't live like this, always looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next move. "You're right," he agreed, leaning forward. "But we don't know enough yet. I've got some people I can reach out to, contacts from work. I'll dig into this group, see what I can find. But for now, we need to stay put. Let the security team do their job." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but she held back, knowing they didn't have any better options. "Okay," she said quietly, though her worry was evident. "We'll stay. But if they find us here—" "They won't," Michael cut in firmly. "We'll be ready." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of tension. The security team arrived as promised, installing cameras, securing the perimeter, and setting up a command center in Michael's office. The house became a fortress, but it still didn't feel like enough. Not with the threat hanging over them like a dark cloud. By late afternoon, Michael had retreated to his office, making calls, pulling every string he could to gather information. He needed answers about the people after Emma, about how far they were willing to go. But every lead seemed to hit a dead end. Sarah stayed close to Emma, trying to keep her occupied with books, TV, anything to distract her. But the little girl's silence was unnerving. She hadn't asked any questions, hadn't cried, hadn't even shown much emotion beyond that initial fear. Michael could see it in her eyes. She was waiting for the danger to come crashing through their front door. By evening, Michael was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained from the weight of it all. He sat on the edge of his bed, running a hand through his hair as Sarah entered the room quietly. She sat down beside him, the unspoken tension between them hanging in the air. "This can't go on like this," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling. "Emma's scared. I'm scared. We can't just keep waiting for them to strike." Michael looked at her, the frustration and helplessness evident in his eyes. "I know, but we don't have a choice right now. We need more time." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since she had shown up at his door, she let her guard down. "Michael, what if they take her? What if I lose her again? I can't let that happen." Michael's chest tightened. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We won't let that happen, Sarah. I promise." I'm not going to let anyone take her from us. She nodded, wiping at her eyes, but the fear lingered between them. They both knew the promise, though sincere, was fragile. The danger was real, and it was closing in. Later that night, after checking on Emma and making sure she was asleep, Michael stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street. The security team patrolled the grounds, their presence a small comfort, but his mind was far from at ease. Everything had changed in the blink of an eye. He had gone from a man consumed by his career, living in isolation, to a father, responsible for a child he barely knew but already loved fiercely. And the stakes couldn't be higher. Sarah joined him at the window, her presence a quiet solace in the chaos. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. "You really think we're safe here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael didn't answer right away. He stared out at the night, at the shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should, and shook his head slightly. "I don't know, but I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe, Sarah. Whatever it takes." The words hung between them, a solemn vow in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. The night stretched on, and the world outside seemed darker, more dangerous than ever. Somewhere out there, in the shadows, the threat lingered. And Michael knew this was just the calm before the storm. The tension in the house was palpable, pressing in from every corner. It had been days since the security team arrived, transforming Michael's mansion into a fortress, but the sense of safety was fragile at best. The quiet nights stretched longer, each one feeling like a ticking clock, waiting for the inevitable. Michael sat in his office, his eyes fixed on the security monitors displaying a live feed from every corner of the property. The weight of responsibility hung heavy on his shoulders. He could feel the pressure building. Emma was in danger, and with each passing hour, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. Sarah walked in quietly, her face drawn and tired. "How much longer can we keep this up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced at the monitors, the flickering images of guards patrolling the grounds doing little to ease her nerves. Michael didn't answer right away. He rubbed the back of his neck, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't answer. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we can't let our guard down. Not until we figure out who's behind all of this and how far they're willing to go." Sarah nodded, but her eyes betrayed the fear that had taken root deep inside her. She looked worn, beaten down by the constant stress of watching over Emma, of waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Emma asked me today if she could go outside and play," Sarah said, her voice tinged with sadness. "She doesn't understand why we're keeping her locked up. She's scared, but she's also confused. And I don't know how much longer we can keep pretending everything's fine." Michael looked at her, his heart aching with the weight of the situation. "We'll figure this out," he said, trying to sound convincing, even though doubt gnawed at him from the inside. "We have to." But even as he said the words, the uncertainty hung in the air between them. They both knew that the real danger wasn't just outside the walls. It was the growing tension, the strain of trying to protect a child while their own unresolved history simmered beneath the surface. Later that evening, Michael found himself sitting at the edge of the bed, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. His body ached, not from physical exertion, but from the emotional strain of trying to hold everything together. The responsibility of being a father, something he had never prepared for, had hit him like a tidal wave, and now, the stakes were impossibly high. Sarah appeared at the doorway, leaning against the frame. The soft glow of the hallway light cast shadows across her face, highlighting the exhaustion that matched his own. She hesitated before stepping into the room, her voice quiet but steady. "Michael, we need to talk." He looked up at her, already feeling the tension building. He knew this conversation was coming, but he wasn't ready. He didn't think he ever would be. "I've been thinking," she continued, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, "about everything. About us, about Emma, and about why I made the choices I did." Michael stood up, crossing the room to stand in front of her. "Sarah, She cut him off, her tone sharper than before. "No, you need to listen. I know you're angry with me. I know you hate that I kept Emma from you, and I've been carrying that guilt for years. But you have to understand, I didn't do it to hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting her? Michael's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. You didn't give me a choice, Sarah. You made that decision for both of us. And now, look where we are. Our daughter is in danger because of choices you made without me. Sarah flinched, the pain in his words cutting deep. I know, she whispered, and I regret it every single day. But none of that matters anymore. The only thing that matters now is keeping her safe. There was a long pause, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions. Michael's anger simmered, but beneath it was something deeper. A sense of loss, of missed chances, and the overwhelming weight of love he hadn't been able to give Emma. We can't keep doing this, Sarah said, her voice cracking with exhaustion. This back and forth, this blame. It's tearing us apart, and Emma can feel it. She needs us to be strong, Michael. She needs us to be united. Michael stared at her, the words sinking in. She was right. The constant tension between them wasn't helping anyone, least of all Emma. They had to find a way to move past the hurt, to work together for their daughter's sake. Okay, Michael said finally, his voice softer than before. You're right. We need to focus on Emma. We need to put all this behind us, at least for now. Sarah's shoulders relaxed, a small breath of relief escaping her lips. Thank you, she said quietly. I don't know how long we can keep her safe, but at least we'll do it together. Just as they were beginning to find some semblance of peace, a sharp, jarring sound shattered the moment. The security alarm blared through the house, piercing the quiet with a sense of urgency that froze them both in place. Michael's heart jumped into his throat as he raced toward the control panel. The flashing red lights on the screen confirmed his worst fears. Someone had breached the perimeter. Michael's hands shook as he pressed the intercom button. What's going on? He barked, his voice laced with panic. A security guard's voice crackled through the speaker. We've got movement outside the north entrance. It's more than one person. We're moving to intercept. Michael's mind raced. He turned to Sarah, who stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale with fear. Stay with Emma, he ordered, his voice tight. Keep her safe. Lock the doors. Without waiting for her response, Michael sprinted down the hall, his heart pounding in his chest. The security team had been prepared for this, but knowing they were out there, whoever they were, made his skin crawl with dread. As he reached the back of the house, the sound of footsteps and muffled voices came from outside. He peered through the window, his breath catching in his throat. Shadows moved in the darkness, several figures creeping toward the house, their intent unmistakable. Michael's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to protect his family. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy flashlight, his only weapon against whatever was coming. His pulse thundered in his ears as he took his position near the door, ready to defend. Outside, the guards were engaging with the intruders, shouts and scuffling breaking the stillness of the night. The sound of a window shattering in the distance sent a jolt of terror through Michael's body. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the glass door, their face obscured by the darkness. Michael's grip tightened on the flashlight as the door handle rattled, the intruder testing it, looking for a way in. Time seemed to stretch impossibly long in that moment, every second dragging as Michael waited, prepared to strike. The world outside had invaded their sanctuary, and there was no telling what the next few minutes would bring. But one thing was clear. The danger was no longer lurking. It had arrived, and Michael was ready to fight with everything he had to protect Emma, to protect Sarah, to protect the life he had only just begun to understand. And the fight was only just beginning. The moments after the confrontation felt like a haze, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. The security team had managed to fend off the intruders, but the damage had been done. The broken window, the scattered glass, and the ominous sense that they had only delayed the inevitable weighed heavily on Michael as he stood in the dim light of the kitchen, his body still pulsing with adrenaline. Sarah was with Emma in the living room, trying to soothe her after the chaos. Emma hadn't said a word since the security alarm had blared through the house, and her silence unnerved Michael more than anything else. He had only known her for a few days, but the instinct to protect her had rooted deep inside him. The fear in her eyes earlier was something he couldn't shake. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. Staying here was no longer an option. They were sitting ducks, waiting for the next attack. But even as his mind worked on a solution, a deeper part of him was struggling with something far more complicated. Sarah. They hadn't resolved anything. The years of anger, of resentment, of being kept in the dark about his own daughter, they all hung in the air between them, unresolved. And now, in the middle of this storm, they had to confront it, whether they were ready or not. Michael took a deep breath and made his way to the living room. He found Sarah sitting on the edge of the couch, her arms wrapped protectively around Emma, who was curled up in her lap, eyes wide and distant. Sarah looked up when she saw him enter, her face etched with exhaustion and worry. "We need to talk," Michael said, his voice quieter than he expected. There was no anger this time, just the weight of everything they hadn't said. Sarah nodded, carefully easing Emma onto the couch. "Stay here for a minute, sweetheart," she whispered to her, brushing a hand through Emma's hair before standing up. They moved into the hallway, just out of Emma's earshot. The tension was thick between them, but the urgency of the situation left no room for hesitation. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine," Michael began, his voice trembling with the strain of everything he'd been holding back. "You kept Emma from me for years, Sarah. You made a decision that wasn't yours to make, and now she's caught in the middle of this nightmare. And I'm just supposed to move past that?" Sarah's face tightened, the guilt evident in her eyes. "You think I haven't been living with that decision every day?" She shot back, her voice low but fierce. "You think I don't regret it? I made a mistake, Michael. I know that, but I didn't do it to hurt you. I did it because I thought I was doing what was best for her." "Best for her?" Michael's voice cracked, the emotion spilling over. "You didn't even give me the chance to be there for her. I missed everything, Sarah." Her first words, her first steps. He stopped, his chest tightening as the realization of all he had lost hit him again. Sarah took a step closer, her voice softening. "I know, and I'm sorry. I should have told you. I should have trusted you to make that decision with me. But I was scared, Michael. I was scared that you'd choose your career over her, that you'd disappear like you did before. I didn't know if you were ready to be a father." Michael turned away, unable to look at her for a moment. He clenched his fists, trying to push down the anger, the hurt, the sense of betrayal that still lingered. "I might not have been perfect back then, but I would have been there for her. For both of you." Sarah let out a shaky breath, her own emotions bubbling to the surface. "I know. I realize that now. But it's too late to change the past, Michael. All we can do now is figure out how to protect her, how to keep her safe." The weight of her words hung between them. There was no going back. The past was done, and no amount of regret could change what had happened. But Michael knew that holding on to his anger wasn't going to help Emma. It wasn't going to fix the situation they were in now. He turned back to Sarah, the fight draining out of him. "I don't know how to move forward from this, Sarah," he admitted, his voice quieter. "But you're right. Right now, the only thing that matters is Emma. We have to focus on her." Sarah's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a moment of understanding between them. "I know it's hard," she said gently, "but we'll figure it out. Together." Michael nodded, though the pain still lingered. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, not for them, and certainly not for Emma. But in that moment, they both knew they couldn't let their past define their future. Not when their daughter's life was at stake. Just as they stood there, grappling with the weight of their shared history, a knock at the door shattered the fragile moment. Michael's heart lurched, and he exchanged a quick glance with Sarah before stepping toward the front of the house. One of the security guards stood outside, his face grim. "We've checked the perimeter again, Mr. Carter. The intruders have pulled back for now, but we found something you need to see." Michael's stomach twisted. He stepped outside, Sarah close behind him, and followed the guard to the far side of the house. There, on the ground, was a message scrawled in spray paint, crude and hurried but chilling in its clarity. "You can't hide her forever." The words sent a chill down Michael's spine. They weren't just a warning, they were a promise. The people after Emma weren't going to stop. They had no intention of giving up, and as long as Emma was with them, The danger would never go away. Sarah stared at the message, her face pale. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Michael stared at the message, his mind racing. He felt the full weight of his responsibility, of the promise he had made to protect his daughter, pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting for her safety, he was fighting for her future. "We can't stay here," Michael said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We need to leave. Tonight." Sarah looked at him, startled. "Where will we go?" "I have a place," he said, already making plans in his mind. "Somewhere they won't find us. But we have to move now, before they get any closer." The decision was made. There was no turning back. The fight wasn't over. It had barely begun. But this time, they would be ready. As they hurried back inside to gather their things, Michael glanced at Emma, who sat quietly on the couch, unaware of the storm raging around her. And in that moment, he made a silent vow. He would not lose her. Not now. Not ever. The drive through the dark, winding roads was tense. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds. His heart raced, though he forced himself to appear calm for Emma's sake. Beside him, Sarah sat silently, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on her lap. Emma was in the back seat, buckled in and staring out the window, too quiet for a child her age. She didn't ask where they were going, and that silence was what tore at Michael the most. After seeing the threatening message scrawled across his property, there had been no choice but to leave. Staying in the house any longer was a death sentence. The people hunting Emma were growing bolder, more desperate, and now it was only a matter of time before they made their next move. "How much further?" Sarah asked, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice was shaky but determined. "Another hour," Michael replied, glancing at her briefly. "It's a private cabin upstate. No one knows about it. We'll be safe there for a while." Sarah nodded, but Michael could tell that neither of them truly believed they would ever be safe. Not until the threat was completely neutralized. Still, they had to act like they had control, even if the danger followed them into the shadows. As they drove, Michael's mind worked through the plan they had hastily put together. He had already contacted a trusted friend who worked in law enforcement, and they'd agreed to meet in a few days. This friend had resources, connections that stretched far beyond the city's reach, and Michael was counting on them to help expose the people chasing Emma. But until then, they had to hide. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Sarah asked quietly, her eyes flicking toward the side mirror as if expecting someone to emerge from the darkness. "I don't know," Michael admitted, "but we can't take any chances. We'll lie low for a few days and figure out our next move." He glanced at Emma through the rearview mirror, his chest tightening. She looked so small, so fragile, and it filled him with a deep, protective instinct he had never known before. He had missed years of her life, but from this point forward, he was determined not to fail her. Not again. The road stretched out before them, empty and quiet, and for the first time in days, Michael felt a flicker of hope that maybe they could outrun the danger, if only for a little while. When they finally arrived at the cabin, the air was thick with tension. Michael parked the car and stepped out into the night, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The cabin was isolated, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was the perfect hiding spot, but the isolation also made him uneasy. Sarah got out of the car, pulling Emma along with her. "This is where we're staying?" Emma asked, her voice small. "Just for a few days, sweetheart," Michael said, crouching down to her level. "It's safe here. I promise." Emma looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty, but she nodded. She hadn't complained once, and that worried him even more. No child should have to live in constant fear, and the fact that she had adapted so quickly to their dangerous situation was a sign of just how much she had been through. They entered the cabin, and Michael quickly began securing the doors and windows, checking every lock, every possible entry point. Sarah led Emma into the small living area, doing her best to make the space feel less like a hiding spot and more like a temporary home. "We'll be okay here," Sarah said softly, as much to herself as to Emma. "We're safe now." But the uncertainty lingered in the air, unspoken. After the cabin was secured, Michael collapsed into a chair, his mind still racing. They had bought themselves time, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. He needed to put their plan into action, and soon. Sarah joined him, sitting across from him at the table. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. "Do you think your friend can really help?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with quiet hope. Michael nodded, though the doubt gnawed at him. If anyone can help, it's him. He has connections, people who can dig into this group, figure out who's after us and why. And then what? Sarah's eyes locked on his, filled with fear and exhaustion. "What happens when we know who they are?" "Then we stop them," Michael said, his voice low but resolute. "We stop them before they get any closer." Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she rubbed her temples. "I don't know if I can do this, Michael. I don't know if I can keep pretending like everything's going to be okay." Michael leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "We don't have a choice, Sarah. We have to hold it together for Emma. She's counting on us." Sarah's eyes welled with unshed tears, but she nodded, wiping them away quickly. "I know. I don't know how much more I can take. I feel like I'm falling apart." Michael reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "We'll get through this. Together." For a moment, the tension between them eased. The years of unresolved pain and anger seemed to melt away, replaced by the shared determination to protect their daughter at all costs. They had both made mistakes, but none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was Emma's safety. As the hours passed and the night deepened, the cabin grew quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, her small form curled up under a blanket. Sarah sat beside her, stroking her hair, her own eyes heavy with exhaustion. Michael stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. His mind raced, running through every possible scenario, every threat that could still be out there. The danger felt closer now, more real, despite the miles they had put between themselves and the city. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the stillness. He pulled it out, his heart pounding. It was a message from his contact, the friend who was supposed to help them. Michael's hands trembled as he opened the message, his eyes scanning the words. "They know. Be careful. Trust no one." Michael's blood ran cold. He felt the air leave his lungs as the gravity of the message hit him. They were compromised. Even here, in the middle of nowhere, they weren't safe. He looked over at Sarah, who was now watching him with wide eyes, sensing something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael clenched his jaw, his mind racing for a solution. "They found us." Sarah's face paled, and she instinctively pulled Emma closer to her. "What do we do now?" Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he made the only decision he could. "We run. We leave right now." Sarah didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. She simply nodded, the fear in her eyes mirroring his own. They had no choice. The night air was thick, cold, and oppressive as Michael and Sarah hastily packed up their few belongings. Every second felt like a countdown to disaster. Michael's pulse thudded in his ears as he zipped Emma's small backpack, his mind spinning through 100 scenarios, none of them good. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whoever had found them, they wouldn't wait much longer to strike. Sarah moved quickly, guiding Emma with a calm urgency that belied the terror simmering beneath her surface. "It's going to be okay, baby," she whispered to Emma, even as her eyes betrayed the truth. Emma clung to her, silent and wide-eyed, trusting her mother's reassurances but sensing the danger that loomed around them. Michael grabbed the car keys and nodded to Sarah. "We need to go now. We'll head north. Keep moving until we know we're in the clear." They stepped outside into the biting cold, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound in the stillness of the forest surrounding the cabin. Michael felt exposed out here, as if eyes were watching from the darkness, tracking their every move. He motioned for Sarah to get Emma into the car while he scanned the perimeter one last time. The headlights flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the trees. Just as Michael was about to get in the driver's seat, a figure emerged from the darkness. "Don't move." The voice was calm, menacing. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. Out of the shadows stepped a man, tall, built like a predator, his eyes cold and calculating. He held a gun pointed directly at Michael's chest. Sarah's gasp echoed through the silence. She pulled Emma close, her body blocking the child from the man's line of sight. "Michael!" Her voice was barely a whisper, laced with terror. Michael slowly raised his hands, his heart pounding. "Look, you don't have to do this. We don't want trouble. Just let us go, and we'll disappear. You'll never hear from us again." The man didn't flinch, didn't lower the gun. His eyes flicked to the car, then back to Michael. "You think you can just run? You think you can hide her forever?" Michael clenched his jaw, his mind racing for a way out. He needed to keep this man talking, to buy them time. "She's just a child," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "She doesn't deserve this. Whatever you're after, it's not her." The man's lips curled into a cold smile. "It's not about what she deserves. It's about what you and her mother know. The people I work for, they don't like loose ends." Behind him, Michael could feel Sarah's fear radiating off her in waves. Emma was trembling, too scared to move or even cry. Michael knew they couldn't run. Not now. Not without risking everything. His mind raced. He couldn't reach for his phone without getting shot. He couldn't overpower this man, not with the gun aimed directly at him. But there was one thing he still had, a will to protect his family at any cost. "Look," Michael said, taking a small step forward, trying to appear non-threatening. "There's no need to involve them. Whatever Sarah knows, we can figure something out. I'll make sure she stays quiet. But if you hurt them, if you touch my daughter—" His voice dropped, a lethal edge creeping in. "I swear to God, I'll make sure you regret it." The man's smile faded, replaced by a steely resolve. "That's not your call to make." Everything happened in an instant. A loud crack split the air as the man fired a shot, missing Michael by mere inches as he dove to the side. The sound of the gunfire jolted Sarah into action. She yanked open the back door of the car, shoving Emma inside. "Stay down, Emma. Don't move," she screamed, slamming the door shut before the man could aim at her. Michael scrambled to his feet, his pulse thundering in his ears. There was no time to think, only act. The man leveled the gun at him again, but Michael was faster. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy tree branch lying on the ground, and swung it with all his strength. The impact caught the man off guard, the branch connecting with his arm and sending the gun flying into the dirt. Michael didn't stop. He tackled the man to the ground, adrenaline surging through his veins as they wrestled in the cold mud. The man was strong, but Michael was fueled by something more: desperation. The need to protect his daughter, to keep her safe, no matter the cost. "Michael!" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. She had managed to grab the gun, her hands shaking as she aimed it at the man, her eyes wide with terror. "Let him go," she screamed. The man's eyes flicked to the gun in her hands, and for the first time, Michael saw a flash of uncertainty in his cold gaze. He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Michael slammed his fist into the man's face, knocking him unconscious. Michael staggered to his feet, panting, his entire body trembling with the rush of adrenaline. Sarah rushed to his side, her hands still clutching the gun, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Is he?" Sarah's voice shook as she glanced down at the man's still form. "He's out cold," Michael panted, wiping blood from his lip. "But we don't have much time. We need to go. Now." Sarah nodded, her face pale but resolute. Together, they dragged the unconscious man into the back of the cabin, tying him up with whatever they could find. Michael made sure he was secure. There was no telling how much time they had before he woke up. With the man bound and unconscious, they rushed back to the car. Emma sat in the back seat, still trembling but silent, her eyes wide with fear. Michael knelt down beside her, gently cupping her face in his hands. "Hey," he whispered, his voice soft despite the panic still coursing through him. "It's okay. We're safe now. We're going to get through this, I promise." Emma nodded slowly, though the fear in her eyes hadn't faded. Michael kissed her forehead, his heart breaking at the thought of what she had just witnessed. No child should ever have to go through this. They got into the car, and Michael started the engine, his hands still shaking as they sped away from the cabin. The road stretched out before them, dark and endless, but they didn't stop. Not until they were sure they had put enough distance between them and the nightmare that had followed them. As they drove into the night, Michael's mind raced with thoughts of what came next. The danger wasn't over, but for the first time in days, he felt like they had a chance, a real chance, to make it out of this alive. But deep down, he knew the final confrontation was still ahead. And this time, there would be no running. The cold, early morning fog hung thick in the air as Michael steered the car down a desolate road. The weight of everything that had happened pressed on his chest, but the knowledge that this was almost over gave him a sliver of hope. In the back seat, Emma slept, her tiny form bundled under a blanket. Her breathing was steady, but the tension in her small body hadn't fully released. Sarah, sitting beside him, glanced back at Emma before turning to Michael. "We can't keep running, Michael. It has to end tonight." Michael nodded, his jaw set in determination. "It will. They won't stop until we end this." They were heading toward a location that Michael had only shared with one person. His contact, the one they could trust. The plan was simple but dangerous. Lure out the people chasing them and finish this. Michael's contact had set up a safe location in an industrial area near the city outskirts. The place would be monitored and controlled, giving them the best chance to stop the threat once and for all. As the sun began to rise, they arrived at the abandoned warehouse district. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of silence that came before something big. "Stay here with Emma," Michael instructed Sarah as they parked a few blocks away. "I'll go meet my contact and make sure everything is set up." Sarah nodded, though her face was tight with worry. "Be careful," she whispered. Michael gave her a reassuring squeeze on the arm before stepping out of the car. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked through the empty streets, the towering metal structures looming over him like silent giants. Every step echoed in the stillness. He checked his phone. No messages. His contact was supposed to meet him here. Where was he? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Michael turned sharply, his pulse spiking. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, and then he saw him. His contact emerging from the darkness. "You made it," the man said, his voice low but calm. Michael nodded, his body tense with anticipation. "Is everything ready?" "Everything's in place," the contact assured him. "Once they show up, we'll have them surrounded. There's no way out." Michael felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. There was something in the air, an unease that Michael couldn't shake. "Are you sure they'll take the bait?" Michael asked, scanning the area once more. "They'll come," the contact said, but there was a strange edge to his voice that Michael hadn't noticed before. Before Michael could react, he heard it, a sound behind him, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. His stomach dropped. He turned slowly to find another man standing behind him, gun raised, his face hard and emotionless. The trap had been for him. "Michael Carter," the gunman said, his voice cold. "You've been a real pain, but this is where it ends." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. His contact had sold him out. "You've got the wrong idea," Michael said, raising his hands slowly, trying to keep calm. His mind raced, looking for a way out. "You don't have to do this. Just let us go." But the gunman only smiled. "It's not up to me. It's up to the people who want you, and that little girl out of the picture." The mention of Emma sent a bolt of fear through Michael's chest. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the warehouse, a car engine roaring to life. Michael's heart skipped as he recognized it. Sarah. She sped toward them, the car screeching as she barreled down the alleyway. In an instant, chaos erupted. The gunman was momentarily distracted, and Michael seized the opportunity. He lunged forward, knocking the gun from the man's hand and tackling him to the ground. Sarah slammed on the brakes and Emma, wide-eyed and terrified, peeked out from the back seat. "Mom!" she cried, her small voice cutting through the noise. Michael fought with everything he had, adrenaline coursing through him as he struggled to keep the gunman pinned. But the man was strong, stronger than Michael had anticipated. They rolled on the ground, each trying to gain the upper hand. The contact, standing to the side, hesitated, torn between intervening and staying out of the fight. Just when it seemed the gunman was going to overpower Michael, a deafening gunshot echoed through the alley. The gunman froze, his body going limp. Michael turned his head, heart racing, to see Sarah standing there, the gun in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. The gunman fell to the ground, lifeless. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Sarah stared at the body, her chest heaving, the weight of what she had done sinking in. Michael stood, his legs shaking, and walked over to her, gently taking the gun from her hands. "It's over," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she clung to him. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had to protect you. I had to protect Emma." Michael held her tightly, his own emotions raw. "You did what you had to," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." They stood there, holding each other as the danger that had loomed over them for so long finally lifted. It was over. A soft voice interrupted them. "Mom? Dad?" Emma's small figure appeared beside them, her face full of fear and confusion. "Are we safe now?" Michael knelt down, pulling Emma into his arms. He held her tightly, feeling the warmth of her small body against his. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered. "We're safe now." Sarah knelt beside them, her hand gently stroking Emma's hair. "We're safe," she repeated, though her voice was still shaky with everything they had been through. As the sun began to rise, casting a soft light over the warehouse, Michael felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had faced the worst, and they had survived. There would be scars, emotional ones that would take time to heal, but they were together. That was all that mattered. Michael stood, pulling Sarah and Emma into his arms, holding them close. He had spent years not knowing he had a family, but now, in this moment, he knew without a doubt that he would do whatever it took to protect them. Always. Together, they walked back to the car, the sky brightening with the promise of a new day. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael allowed himself to hope for the future. Months had passed since that fateful night, and the scars of what had happened were beginning to fade, though the memories lingered like shadows just beyond reach. Michael stood on the front porch of their new home, nestled far from the chaos of the city, watching Emma play in the yard. Her laughter echoed through the open space, pure and carefree in a way that it hadn't been for so long. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, a soft smile on her face as she watched Emma run through the grass. "She's finally starting to feel like a kid again," she said quietly, leaning against the railing next to Michael. Michael nodded, his heart swelling with a deep sense of gratitude. "She deserves this, peace, safety." He paused, glancing at Sarah. "We all do." After the nightmare they had lived through, after the fear, the running, and the close calls, this life felt almost unreal. The people who had been chasing them were gone, their connections dismantled thanks to Michael's contacts and the authorities who had finally stepped in. But the journey to this point had changed them all. Emma was healing. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were fewer now, her days filled with play, laughter, and the quiet comfort of knowing she was safe. And Michael? He was learning what it meant to be a father, learning that it wasn't just about protecting her, but being there, day after day, for the small moments too, the ones that mattered most. Sarah had found her own peace as well, though the weight of her past decisions still rested on her shoulders. She and Michael had talked, long, difficult conversations where they confronted the pain of what had been lost between them. But in the end, they found something new. Not the relationship they had before, but something stronger, built on understanding, forgiveness, and a shared love for the daughter they were raising together. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if none of this had happened?" Sarah asked, her voice soft, thoughtful. Michael chuckled lightly, a wistful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "All the time. But I think, no matter what, we were always meant to find our way back to her, to each other." Sarah smiled, her hand finding his, fingers lacing together. "Yeah," she whispered, We were. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching Emma chase butterflies in the golden light of the setting sun. The air was warm, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt truly at peace. There were no more threats, no more danger lurking around the corner. Just this, the quiet, simple beauty of a life rebuilt. Emma ran back to them, her face flushed with excitement. "Dad, Mom, look." She held out a small flower, proud of her find. Michael crouched down, taking the delicate flower from her with a smile. "It's beautiful, just like you," he said, ruffling her hair. Emma giggled, wrapping her arms around his neck in a tight hug. Michael closed his eyes, holding her close, his heart full. "Let's go inside," Sarah said, her voice gentle. "It's getting late." Together, they walked into the house, the warmth of the evening settling around them like a protective blanket. As Michael closed the door behind him, he took one last look at the sunset, feeling a quiet sense of completion. They had been through hell, but they had come out stronger. And now, they had a future. One that Michael knew he would never take for granted again. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about work or deadlines or the pressures of the world outside. All that mattered was here, in this home, with his family. And for Michael, that was everything.